Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, norovirus cases surge in the UK leading to a possible 2-day warning period. Bad medical takes gives us horrible nightmares about just what it is people believe, and so very wrongly. J.K. Rowling under fire again for denying the existence of trans kids. Reading may affect your brain, but only when you stop. The implications of giving your pet raw meat may be more significant than you think at first. Google's new chip is supposed to be breaking ground in quantum computing, although we question that. Retroactively correcting history by blackwashing it with regards to Stonehenge. Weird outliers in statistics and just how it is that people don't quite understand what's going on, and NASA is watching as the anomaly in a magnetic field continues to grow. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with norovirus in the UK. Typically speaking, what would make you sick in the UK is their cooking, but in this instance it may just be a virus that has the same effect. They are very much urging individuals, if they suspect they have norovirus, to stay at home for at least 2 days, which is what you should probably be doing anyway, but then again, if you eat UK cooking every day, you would never leave the house. But no, in this case it's actually the norovirus itself. The National Health Services issued a warning saying that if you think you're sick, or if you know you're sick, wait 2 days until it clears its way out of your system. Otherwise, the continued increase in numbers is just going to keep rising, and, well, you don't want that. Signs and symptoms include things like diarrhea, vomiting, and similar. Your fundamental, typical food poisoning type symptoms are just not caused by food poisoning in this case. Well, sort of food poisoning anyway. It is still a gastrointestinal issue, and it involves a, well, in this case obviously virus, but unlike typical instances which are things like salmonella, E. coli, and so on, which are bacteria. In other medical news, but this time rather more entertaining, in a manner of speaking anyway, it's the Schadenfreude of Peter A. McCullough, or formerly Dr. Peter A. McCullough. The reason we say formerly is that their registrations have been revoked. Now, we wouldn't normally crow over the failures of a doctor, or in this case the issues around the doctor losing their license, except in this case, the individual in question is a very strong anti-vaxxer and conspiracy theorist. It's essentially Dr. Oz, just even worse. Yeah. They were supposed to be an internal medicine and cardiovascular disease specialist, which is what makes it so weird that they would manage to mess up so badly that the American Board of Internal Medicine would revoke their ability to practice in this field. Still, anyone who spreads nonsense and crazy around things like COVID-19 vaccines to some extent deserves it, because not only are they talking crap, but they're talking crap that they should know better than. In related news of bad medical takes, we actually have bad medical takes, the X account, giving us examples of people demonstrating not just stupid, but stupid that they should also know better than. For example, an individual claiming not to drink a single drop of water in almost a year. They don't quite understand that most water you consume on a daily basis isn't water in and of itself. It's one of those fundamental misunderstandings around consuming 8 glasses of water a day. That advice is not based on the idea of actually having 8 glasses. The actual research, going way back to the 1940s, is that you would consume roughly that amount in a combination of things like food and drink, but the vast majority is in food. This is why the claim that your body produces its own water is so dumb. Oh, why? Why has the American education system failed so many people? Not to mention the rather stupid claim that electrons don't move in the body unless it's coupled to a hydrogen. No, you don't need a free hydrogen to move them, and technically speaking, a free hydrogen would actually prevent them from being an electron, but nonetheless. The other thing here is the other bad medical take. It's the claim that the COVID-19 contains luciferase and therefore a black light might let you know that somebody has been vaccinated. No, a black light would let you know if you've entered a crime scene, or if the, not if, but definitely that the cheap motel you're staying in hasn't been cleaned for a while.
You know, you really shouldn't lie on that bedspread. I saw this report on TV about how filthy hotel rooms are.
In a moment, we will use the special lights to see just how filthy this seemingly clean hotel room really is.
And also give you nightmares about what actually happened in there. America, you are the gift that keeps on giving, but you're also the gift that people will just want to return as soon as possible. In medical news that's slightly more significant to some people, we have J.K. Rowling under fire for claiming that there is no existence of trans kids, and that medical interventions will be viewed worse than lobotomies one day. J.K. Rowling has made very clear their view on, trans in general, but transitioning particularly for kids, which, given they are essentially a lauded children's author, is somewhat ironic. You would think somebody seen so highly by kids for the work they made in the form of the Harry Potter series would be better received, but situations like this have led them to become a pariah, although in some quarters they're seen as a hero. Take your pick. The issue here is, to a certain extent, trans kids shouldn't exist, because for the most part, most medical treatments as the gold standard rely on kids being treated after they're no longer kids. Generally speaking, prior to then, they're given things like, puberty blockers, psychological therapy, and similar. And then once they become an adult, or at least reach the age of majority, they're going on to medical interventions of the kind that would be permanent and substantial changes. So technically she isn't wrong, but that also requires that medical services are adhering to gold standard therapies and treatment processes, not, as with some, essentially becoming cowboys and doing whatever they want or think is best, which is a problem because a lot of the same health services, let's say, have come under fire by their own governments for doing so, because it isn't the appropriate approach for treating trans kids, because, well, as mentioned, trans kids don't exist. They will eventually become trans people, but that's a separate issue again. To be very clear about this, we're not saying kids should not be supported, particularly with regards to things like transitioning. There is a big difference between supporting children who will transition, for example, providing them with the necessary psychological support and counselling to understand where and how they are, and actual permanent physical changes to their body that will arguably be completely fixable, for lack of a better word, if they ever, change their mind, although, again, a slight oversimplification. And this is a problem we are seeing with quite a number of individuals, and particularly on a larger scale, given the relative surge in transitioning cases over the last 10 years or so. There has been a consequential surge in the number of people detransitioning. As such, leaving it until someone is of an age where they can actually make an informed decision about the rest of their life, in the same way, say, somebody would be allowed to vote, drink, or drive, makes more sense from a pure policy perspective, and it's more in alignment with the best protocols and standards when it comes to this sort of thing. But again, you may disagree. Please do so in the comments section. The next piece of news is also medical, but rather it's a interesting summary of clinical trials from the last year, but all regarding haematology, essentially study of blood. Now, some of this is going to be things like, say, leukemias. Others of them are going to be slightly more pragmatic solutions. And of course, there's a wide range of other topics. This is more to refer you to the nice and neat thread on X that shows you that neat summary, which may or may not be of any interest to you. What may interest you is reading, and reading itself is something most people enjoy. Admittedly, what they're reading and for how long will be substantially variable, but most people do. The key thing here, though, is what happens if you stop reading for some reason. For example, your favorite manga, your favorite series or novel just comes to an end, and you're left with that moment of, what do I do with my life now? Well, it might actually be a more significant issue than you think. It could be having an effect on your brain, or at least one study certainly claiming it has an effect. Whether or not the analyses of 1,000 individuals is really significant and will translate is another matter entirely. In short, The more you read, the more two particular parts of your brain are more developed, essentially enlarged, although strictly speaking they're not larger, they're somewhat denser, and the exact particulars aren't so important. Just understand that the two parts of your brain, one in the temporal lobe and one called the Heschel's gyrus, were significantly more developed, leading to a better language ability. And so, when you look at it, you see that they are thicker, and therefore the cortical structure, the part of your brain that thinks, so to say, rather than connecting everything, leads to better functionality and therefore better ability to use them. We do wonder, however, if thinking is something that some people are getting up to, given that poisoning of pets with cocaine is on the rise. No, your pupper, your cat, or whatever other pet you happen to have should not be given cocaine, or at least shouldn't be able to access cocaine. Which, well, it shouldn't need to be said, but apparently we do. The weird thing here is that it's not just cocaine, but methamphetamine too, which is a worry given that Florida man is already terrifying enough. A Florida dog or cat is really terrifying. The data is only over a short time frame, 2019 to 2023, so we can at least somewhat say that there are probably other factors that come into play than just an increase, considering COVID-19 covers a very large part of that window. The other consideration is that it is a relatively small report, well, reporting size for each of these. For example, there's about 63 cocaine-related reports for cats and about 433 reports for dogs, which does raise a question as to whether or not dogs are snorting cocaine or just more curious about what it is on the table. Sadly, we don't get a great deal more helpful information from this study, given the relatively limited scope of what it is. In slightly more significant and useful information, raw pet food, and particularly raw food diet for pets, is not safe, and this shouldn't be a surprise, more so with the current rise in bird flu. One of the big worries of the bird flu is that cats in particular are far more vulnerable to it, and that's for a simple reason. The receptors that the bird flu uses to get into the bird are very similar, more so than with a human, in the cat to the bird. As such, it can far more easily get into the cat and cause all sorts of issues, and to be blunt about it, kill them. Raw food, particularly from birds that have been infected with avian influenza, will still have avian influenza present, and if you feed it to your cat, well, you can fit the line to this, we're fairly sure. And this is not a theoretical. In fact, it's been very well established so far that several cats have died from bird flu from just this scenario. Admittedly, we are talking about Santa Barbara in California and Washington County in Oregon. So whether they died from that or from hipster exposure, more likely to say the bird flu than we are the hipsters, but, well, you don't really know. Those vegans can be very unusual. The next issue is that there's no significant improvement in the animal's welfare for just feeding them raw food. To be clear about it, it can be useful, particularly if we're talking about trying to minimize the amount of processed food. But minimizing processed food and just giving them raw food are not necessarily the same thing. You can still give an animal, for example a cat or a dog, a cooked meat, which would still be healthy for them, and in many cases healthier given the issues around avian influenza. And it's arguably not that much more difficult. Or you could rely on giving them just dry food, which would theoretically be as healthy for them, if not slightly less healthy, but not in any significant way. Now, we're not going to go through all of the issues here, but we will point out one significant note, and that is the mortality rate for cats exposed to avian influenza. The current rate is between 50 and 100%. In short, there's a chance between a coin flip and absolute certainty of death. These are not odds that any good pet owner should be relying on or considering as remotely reasonable, if they have a way to prevent it from happening. You'll find far more detail in the immunological blog if you wish to read more on this. In news related to life, but not life that currently exists, it's a call by scientists for essentially a moratorium on mirror life. Mirror life may sound like an episode of Black Mirror or something weird and bizarre, but it's actually a thing, and it is far more bizarre than you might think initially. To use a really crude analogy, most molecules as we know them today are in either the left or right variant. For example, if you consume the left variant of limonene, you have a lemon-like taste. If you consume the right-handed version of it, you have the orange-like taste. Now, there are basically no molecules that don't exist in this mirror-type format. It's just that most of the ones that make up anything related to life tend to be the left version. And so, we basically have a left-handed life, which is weird given that left-handed people only make up like 5% of the population. This is where the thought, well, if most life is particularly one mirrored version of this, what if we start making life in the opposite way? Would it be any particular difference? Would it be significant, or is it just a quirk of the way the universe is that the majority of life is in that particular way? The challenge here will be that just about everything to do this would essentially have to be built from the ground up. That is, we would have to create organisms with a genome specifically made in such a way that they would produce all of the mirror molecules, the chiral molecules, that are completely opposite to everything that we know. And it's also why there is essentially a press or push by certain scientists saying this is a bad idea, let's not do this just yet. The reason there's this push not to do it quite yet is fairly straightforward. If you were to use those new novel life forms, making the mirrored version of whatever it is, theoretically there'd be no way to actually break down those products, because there's no existing naturally occurring enzyme or similar that would be able to do anything about it. And this, according to the scientists, could lead to an unchecked explosion in this mirror life, because there is no naturally occurring thing that could deal with it. Essentially, it's introducing a completely foreign and theoretically invasive species into the world. But in the immortal words of Jurassic Park, life finds a way. In less immediately useful, we have Google. Well, not Google itself. Instead, we have Google making a new chip that could theoretically be dealing with one of quantum physics, or quantum computing more accurately, biggest problems, although any claims to this effect essentially need to be taken with a lot of salt. A truckload of salt. The chip called Willow by Google engineers is claimed to have passed a significant milestone in its ability to handle certain errors. Understand, quantum computing is actually a really nightmaric thing to do. You have a lot of challenges around getting it to actually perform in any capacity other than as a quantum computing unit. But that also means there's a lot of errors that are generated in that process. Essentially, you have to translate what it's doing into something a human can understand. It's the gap between the computer being able to do whatever it has to do and keep it stable long enough for a human to be able to go, oh, that's what you're telling me. That is the problem here. As a general rule, quantum computing isn't very stable, and the fact that their chip can make whatever it is they found sit stably for an hour or so is considered a massive achievement, since previous efforts only lasted seconds, if that. What defines Google's Willow processor as distinct from other efforts is that rather than relying on the usual ones and zeros, it has a third function, essentially a supposition where it could be a 1 or a 0. And the challenge here is that you can use that supposition value as a sort of error correcting method, but you need to make sure that the error it's generating in turn aren't being generated at a greater rate than what it's correcting them at. And this is where Willow is superior. It manages to achieve that particular phenomena. That is, it performs better as a way to fix any errors that come up through supposition faster than it can create them. Although whether or not it does that long term is going to be another challenge. But for now, at least in a relatively small scale test of just 105 qubits, in a 7x7 lattice, it could do this, and it could do it twice as fast as those errors it was generating. However, this is also in a very dedicated environment and very specifically oriented task that arguably is where it is the most superior application of quantum computing, which is where it claims it can do something so much better than regular computing power is kinda dodgy. But for the most part, let's just operate on the premise that at least the concept is workable, even if the actual application is not necessarily the greatest test of its function. In similar news, we have the possibility that something could or could not have been, but now that we know the answer, well, we know the answer, but only by actually looking at what happened. And it is how an individual missed out on their opportunity for a Nobel Prize simply because of bad luck and essentially bad networking. It's an individual called Douglas Prasher, and one of their big things in history has been a relationship to the green fluorescent protein. This is a small molecule that glows in the dark, or more accurately, glows in the dark when you apply a certain light to it. This has been an incredibly powerful and useful tool in molecular genetics, because it allows you to study all sorts of processes that are going inside a cell without having to actually destroy or kill whatever it is you're looking at. Essentially, it is like a tracer or a tracker showing you where something is so long as it is attached to it. As mentioned, an incredibly powerful tool, especially in terms of molecular genetics, where it lets you know what certain things are doing inside of any organism at any given time. The reason they essentially failed to get a Nobel Prize was that although they were the one who cloned the gene that made this whole phenomena possible, they weren't actually awarded for it. And in fact, it's the fact that they couldn't get it to work as intended that led to their loss. Their intention was to try exactly what we've described, the ability to insert the gene into something like, say, bacteria and see if they could get it to glow. Unfortunately, they couldn't. But someone else did. This is of course not to say that they necessarily deserved the Nobel Prize. To all intents and purposes, they couldn't get it to work, and as such it required somebody else who could make it work. It's in some respects similar to, say, how certain technology now has been initially created by one person but built on and developed by others. To use a very crude analogy, a lot of what Apple is famous for now is really only successful because Steve Jobs made it popular. The actual technology itself, the underlying facilities, resources, etc. of Mac, aren't actually that unique or special, but the way they're sold, presented, and packaged all together is unique enough for some people to be willing to sell their soul to the devil. The article from the Science is definitely worth a read just to look at how things work, or in this case don't work to some extent, and to learn more about how it is that, well, bad luck can be what it is. In other, let's say, historical news, we have, well, what is simply stupidity. It's an attempt to, retroactively or retcon correct history through making it like Stonehenge was built by Black Britons, which, no, just no, but more importantly, how and why no. First of all, retconning history is a dumb idea, and it's not just dumb because it's stupid and wildly inaccurate, but it does, to a certain extent, actually undermine the very purpose of having history. We understand and learn from history and get better from it. Trying to essentially show history as being a perfect utopia before now means there's no reason to get any better. But if you're trying to do this for a children's book, that's worse again, because you're trying to manipulate people who don't even know enough about the world yet to understand they're being manipulated. But more importantly than that, just from a practical point of view, somebody who was of a darker skin or pigmentation in Britain at the time Stonehenge was built would actually have been in worse health and likely to have died earlier due to an issue around melanin and sunlight exposure, vitamin D, all sorts of other factors. It's why, for a very long time, there was a fairly solid gradient of people's coloration going from the equator all the way up to the very northern hemisphere and all the way down to the southern hemisphere. In order to survive in the long term, the further north you were, you needed lighter skin. This allowed for the sun to penetrate into your skin and give you vitamin D and other things. The further towards the equator you were, the less you needed this and the more protection you needed from sunlight. It's just a basic biological prerogative, let's say. If you want to survive, you need to be able to deal with the environment. And this is why the Telegraph trying to celebrate this is kind of silly and stupid. And we'll just leave it at that. If you want to discuss in the comments, please do. In a similar kind of stupid progressive news, and we say stupid progressive in that it's a dumb thing to do, there's an argument that climate change will affect certain groups of people more than others, primarily looking at women, girls, and gender diverse people. Nature and the world does not give a crap about the nature of your chromosomes, the gametes you produce, or whatever other metric you want to use to define gender. In short, nature has one thing on its mind: kill you, preferably before you have a chance to produce offspring. Yeah, it doesn't care. There's no issues about it. It just wants you gone. This is why Scientific American trying to claim that climate change will affect certain people more than others is just outright ignorant. You could make an argument, and this one's far more legitimate, that certain ethnic groups, for example, people in the Pacific Islands, would be more affected, and that's for rather practical reasons. Climate change will lead to their homeland, their country, their houses are literally being buried underwater, or flooded, however you wish to describe the rising ocean levels, but that's not really targeting them as a particular product of who they are, but where they are. Now, the other possible argument that can be made is that in certain areas, women tend to be the, let's say, breadwinners in certain respects. They tend to be responsible for a lot of the farming in certain places, and as a result, if there's climate change, this will affect those people, and that is at least a more legitimate argument, but even then, you're operating on the basis that it's targeting them, and it's not just a byproduct of how nature works. In similar failures in academic circles, we have two items for you. One is a measure of income and penis size, and the other is a measure of IQ and testosterone levels. Now, in theory, both of these sound like they're kind of interesting, and they are somewhat. Firstly, because there's actually a stupid amount of money, time, and research that goes into figuring out the size of someone's penis. Not because the information itself is actually useful, but because you want to figure out what the average is. Then, if you have whatever phallic improvement device you're trying to sell, you can say, hey, look, you're better than the average. Sometimes. Other times it's for different reasons entirely, but let's work on that basis to start with. But the issue with both of these particular examples is very simple. There's an outlier. One fairly significant outlier in both graphs. And yet, in both respects, it's just that, an outlier. And given that this is all based on survey responses and similar, from, well, to be blunt about it, self-reported data sets, it's not really all that helpful. For all we know, there may have been one particular member of the Kakistani militia who decided that they just needed to screw with whatever was collecting this data and submitted a completely outlandish and ridiculous result. Or, in the other instance, people have consistently and reliably overestimated or underestimated their member. And so they stood to attention, they saluted, and then they fired off their shot. Okay, terrible puns aside, it is literally just that they are survey results. You don't rely on them. It's that simple. In another bit of news, but this time shifting towards space, although not quite there yet, we have NASA and the weird growing anomaly in Earth's magnetic field. Sadly, not doomsday, not some sort of eldritch being summoned. This is somewhat of a naturally or normally occurring thing, but it is still bizarre. There's a weird region of magnetic activity, but it's a weird region in that it's a lower magnetic field intensity than what you would normally expect, and it's been stretching out between South America and Southwest Africa. Essentially, if you took a string between somewhere like Peru, and you stretched it around the world away from New Zealand and Australia, you would eventually come back to the side of somewhere around the higher part of South Africa or thereabouts. That's the area that's been affected, roughly anyway. But the reason it's a concern isn't, as mentioned, because of eldritch beings being summoned, doomsday prophecies, or anything else. Rather, it has more to do with technology and the modern world. Our reliance on satellites and spacecraft is, well, significant, and any, let's say, alteration to the magnetic field on Earth could have an effect on all these things. and not just in terms of the ability to interfere with the signals or screwing around with craft and so on, but protection from the vagaries of space. In fact, one of our biggest worries with this is actually what happens if we have, say, a solar emission, a coronal mass ejection from the sun, and that magnetic field has something in there that we're trying to protect. Suddenly, that vulnerability goes up a lot. The exact cause for this isn't exactly well known, but the current leading theory, so to say, is that the molten core that makes up Earth, and particularly the core of the Earth, has a large area within it which could be moving in a fairly consistent manner, ensuring that that molten core is interfering with that magnetic field around Earth, and that currently that particular bit of the molten iron core is, well, between South Africa and Peru, or thereabouts. One, let's say, notable effect, particularly if you like to see the southern lights, is that this change in the magnetic field will actually have an effect on the intensity of them, and should theoretically make it less obvious when the lights appear, which is rather unfortunate. The final news item we have for you is all related to actual outer space proper, and it has to do with tracing a fast radio burst. Now, this might seem like a weird thing to do. We know where radio bursts come from. You find your nearest radio tower and there's your answer. But no, what we're talking about here is signals coming from outside Earth. Now, the detection of this was way back in 2022. Way back in terms of how fast academia is meant to move. Then again, it's astronomy, and astronomy is kind of glacial, so yeah. Anyway, the MIT researchers believe they may have figured out where the signal is coming from, or at least possibly figured out where they're coming from. The leading theory in this case is something called magnet stars. They're essentially weird and bizarre neutron stars, which have unusually and very dense cores, which is what's left over after the star has gone through the supernova process. Now, it's thought that with these massive stars after they've essentially collapsed leading to the supernova, you get a neutron star, and they have magnetic fields that are stupidly powerful, thousands of times stronger than what you would expect from a typical star, and that these could be what's behind it. Why they think this is that, theoretically, these stupidly dense and powerful magnetic fields that make up the remnant of the star could be destroying whatever few atoms remain after the supernova has occurred. And we say very few understand that we are talking still stupid amounts of atoms just in a very tight space and essentially condensed to a stupid degree. When they get destroyed, they may be released as radio waves, and this is what we're observing. So sadly, it's not aliens trying to communicate with us, although History Channel may say otherwise, but it also means that we only have a theoretical answer, we don't have an actual answer. This is only further reinforced and legitimized, let's say, through further research, which, to be clear about it, it's complicated, so we'll try and simplify it. By taking the signal, they then were able to look at the way it's actually appearing as a S-shaped angle, and then using this again, they could then figure out its rough origin point. By this, they could then try and further figure out via the degree of scintillation, which is, no, let's just not go down that pathway, more or less allows them to figure out again where it came from by further narrowing down the area where it could have originated from. Then again, by using other astronomical mechanisms and methods, they're able to further narrow it down. And here's where they can figure out that it's probably the magnet star that's the source. They narrowed down that range to within 10,000 kilometers of the magnet star. That's pretty much as close to accurate and dead center as you can get with this particular approach. To be clear about it, you've gone from billions of kilometers down to 10,000 kilometers, which is such a narrow range that you almost absolutely say this is it. Of course, there's an entirely, and not unremotely possible, option that they're wrong and that something weird has happened here. For example, when someone past weeks forgot to add an extra 0, and because of that, their numbers were off by a factor of 10. But even with that, it's pretty damn likely that this is the source at this stage. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.